The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the small warehouse office where David sat during his lunch break. At 42 years old, his hands bore the marks of 17 years loading boxes and managing inventory. Rough calluses dotted his palms, and a faint scar ran across his left thumb from a mishap with packing tape 3 years ago. But these same hands held a secret that nobody at work knew about. Every evening after dinner, while most people settled in front of their televisions, David would walk to the corner of his living room. There sat an old upright piano, its wood finish worn smooth by decades of use. The keys were slightly yellowed, and middle C stuck just a tiny bit if you didn't press it firmly enough. This piano had belonged to his grandmother, and it was the most precious thing he owned. His daughter Rachel had come home from school that Tuesday with an unusual sparkle in her eyes. She was 16, at that age where she thought she knew everything and her dad knew nothing. They'd been having the same argument for weeks about him being too cautious, too afraid to step outside his comfort zone. "Dad, you should audition," she said, dropping her backpack on the kitchen table with a thud. David looked up from chopping vegetables for dinner. "Audition for what?" "That talent show. The big one. Everyone watches it." She pulled out her phone and showed him the audition announcement. "They're coming to Cleveland next month. You play piano better than anyone I know." He laughed, but it came out nervous and uncertain. "Sweetheart, I play in our living room." "That's different from performing in front of thousands of people." "Why is it different?" Rachel pressed, her voice taking on that challenging tone teenagers master so well. "Music is music. You're amazing, but you act like it doesn't matter because you just do it at home." David returned to his vegetables, the rhythmic chopping filling the silence. His daughter didn't understand. She couldn't possibly know what it felt like to be ordinary, to blend into the background, to be the kind of person nobody noticed. He'd spent his entire adult life being reliable, steady, unremarkable. Warehouse managers didn't suddenly become performers, but Rachel wouldn't let it go. Over the next 3 weeks, she brought it up constantly. During commercial breaks, at breakfast, when he drove her to soccer practice. She showed him videos of other ordinary people who had auditioned, their lives changed forever by one moment of courage. "What's the worst that could happen?" she asked one evening while he practiced a particularly difficult passage. David's fingers paused on the keys. "They could laugh at me. So what if they do?" Rachel sat down next to him on the piano bench, the same spot where her great-grandmother used to sit. "Isn't it worse to never try? To always wonder what might have happened?" Something in her words cracked through his defenses. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, with a mixture of hope and belief he hadn't seen in years. Or maybe it was the memory of his grandmother, who had spent countless hours teaching him, always insisting he had a gift even when he doubted himself. The online application took him 2 hours to complete. He kept starting and stopping, his finger hovering over the delete button more times than he could count. Finally, at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, he clicked submit before he could change his mind again. 3 weeks later, an email arrived. He'd been selected for an audition. His heart pounded as he read the details. "Report to the convention center downtown at 7 in the morning. Bring sheet music if needed. Prepare for a long day of waiting." David told exactly 2 people, Rachel and his younger brother Tom. Tom's reaction wasn't encouraging. "You're really going through with this?" Tom asked over the phone, his skepticism clear. "No offense, but you're not exactly the performer type. These shows are for people with, stage presence, charisma." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," David replied, though the words stung because they echoed his own doubts. "I'm just being realistic. You're a great piano player, but that's different from being an entertainer. These shows want personalities, not just talent." After hanging up, David sat at his piano and stared at the keys without playing. Tom was probably right. He wasn't dynamic or flashy. He didn't have a dramatic backstory beyond being an ordinary guy who loved music. Who was he kidding? But then Rachel came downstairs, drawn by the silence. "You're thinking about backing out, aren't you?" Maybe this was a mistake. She sat beside him and played a few random notes. "Grandma wouldn't want you to give up before you even tried. She always said you had something special." The morning of the audition arrived gray and drizzly. David put on his only suit, a navy blue one he'd bought 6 years ago for his cousin's wedding. It fit a bit snugly around the middle these days. He spent 10 minutes trying to fix his tie, his hands shaking so badly he had to start over 3 times. The convention center was massive and intimidating. Hundreds of people crowded the holding area, each one seeming more confident and polished than the last. There were singers practicing scales, dancers stretching, musicians tuning instruments. Many wore professional-looking outfits and carried expensive equipment cases. David clutched his worn folder of sheet music and found a seat in the back corner. The woman next to him had bright pink hair and was scrolling through her phone, showing her friend a video with millions of views. "That's from my last performance," she said loudly. "I have like 60,000 followers now." Around him, everyone seemed to belong except him. They had the look of performers, that indefinable quality of people who were meant to be on stage. David felt like an imposter, a middle-aged warehouse manager playing dress-up. The waiting was brutal. Hours crawled by as groups of contestants were called. Some returned looking elated, others fighting back tears. The longer David sat, the more his confidence evaporated. What had he been thinking? These people were professionals, or at least semi-professionals. He was just a guy who played piano in his living room. "Number 847, you're up in 5 minutes," a production assistant called out, scanning a clipboard. David's stomach dropped. That was his number. He stood on unsteady legs, his sheet music nearly slipping from his sweaty hands. The production assistant, a young woman with a headset, gave him a practiced smile. "First time?" she asked, not unkindly. He nodded, not trusting his voice. "You'll do great. Just breathe and be yourself. Be yourself." That was the problem, wasn't it? Himself wasn't interesting enough, wasn't special enough. But it was too late to run now. The production assistant was leading him down a corridor toward the stage entrance. Through the curtain, he could hear the muffled sounds of the audience and the judges talking. His heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth had gone completely dry. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around and leave. Then he thought of Rachel's face when he'd left that morning. The pride in her eyes, the way she'd hugged him and whispered, "Make Grandma proud." "Ready?" the production assistant asked, her hand on the curtain. David took a deep breath. Ready or not, this was happening. "Number 847, he heard the announcement boom across the stage. "Come on out." He stepped through the curtain into a wall of light and sound, and his entire world changed. The lights hit David like a physical force. Blinding white spotlights from every direction made him squint as he walked across what felt like a mile of empty stage. His dress shoes clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing in the enormous space. He could sense the audience out there in the darkness beyond the lights. Thousands of people he couldn't see but could feel watching him. The stage was bigger than he'd imagined from watching the show on television. A massive grand piano sat in the center, gleaming black under the lights. It looked incredibly expensive, probably worth more than his car. Behind the judges' table, he could make out 4 silhouettes, but their faces were obscured by the glare. As his eyes adjusted, David heard it. A ripple of laughter from somewhere in the audience. Quiet at first, then spreading like water, finding cracks in concrete. His suit suddenly felt cheaper, tighter, more obviously wrong. He became hyper-aware of everything about himself. The way his jacket pulled across his shoulders, the slight punch of his stomach, the nervous shuffle of his walk that had none of the confident stride the previous performers had displayed. He reached the piano and stood there awkwardly, not quite sure where to look or what to do with his hands. The sheet music folder felt slippery in his sweaty palms. "Hello there," came a voice from the judges' table. It was smooth and authoritative, belonging to Victoria Hayes, the head judge and a Grammy-winning producer. "What's your name?" "David. David Chen." His voice cracked slightly on his last name, and he heard another scatter of giggles. "And what do you do, David?" This voice was different, belonging to Michael Stone, a judge famous for his brutally honest critiques and sharp tongue. "I'm a warehouse manager in Cleveland." Why had he added that last part? As if the city mattered. Michael leaned back in his chair, and even from a distance, David could see the smirk forming. "A warehouse manager. And you're here to sing for us today?" "No, sir, piano." "Piano," Michael repeated, glancing at his fellow judges. One of them, Linda Martinez, a celebrated Broadway director, covered her mouth as she whispered something to the 4th judge, Robert Kim, a pop star turned music mogul. They both smiled. The laughter in the audience grew louder. Not cruel exactly, but amused. The kind of laughter reserved for something unexpected and slightly ridiculous, like watching a penguin try to fly. Victoria leaned forward. "That's wonderful, David. Do you have professional training? Did you study at a conservatory?" "No, ma'am. My grandmother taught me." "Your grandmother. Michael said, his eyebrows rising. Is she here today? In the audience supporting you? David's throat tightened. No, she passed away last year. The atmosphere shifted slightly. A few sympathetic murmurs rippled through the crowd. Victoria's expression softened. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sure she'd be proud that you're here. But Michael wasn't done. Let me guess. You played at her funeral? Maybe some dinner parties? Birthday gatherings? His tone wasn't mean exactly, but it carried that edge of skepticism that made David's face burn. I mostly play at home. For myself. The admission felt like a defeat. At home, Michael repeated, looking at the other judges. On what kind of piano? An upright. It was my grandmother's. Robert Kim spoke up for the first time, his voice gentler than Michael's. That's sweet, man, really. But you understand this is a professional competition? We've had concert pianists audition. People who've performed at Carnegie Hall. David nodded, feeling smaller with each passing second. What had he been thinking? These people were right to be skeptical. He was completely out of his league. Well, Victoria said with professional courtesy, we're happy to hear what you've prepared. Please, take a seat. David walked to the piano bench, and as he moved, he heard more laughter. Someone in the audience said something he couldn't quite catch, followed by a burst of louder giggles. His hands trembled as he set his sheet music on the piano's stand. The paper shook visibly, advertising his nervousness to everyone watching. He sat down and immediately knew the bench was wrong. Too high. He fumbled with the adjustment knob, his fingers slipping. It took him 3 tries to lower it, and with each failed attempt he heard more snickering. The production assistant, who had been so kind backstage, now stood in the wings, her encouraging smile replaced with a worried grimace. Michael leaned over to Linda and whispered something. Both of them chuckled. The microphones weren't supposed to pick it up, but in the quiet of the auditorium, David heard Michael say, "This should be interesting." The words hit him like a slap. His vision blurred slightly, and for a terrifying moment, he forgot what piece he'd planned to play. His mind went completely blank. The sheet music in front of him might as well have been written in a foreign language. He stared at the keys. 88 black and white rectangles that suddenly seemed like a complex puzzle he'd never solved before. His fingers hovered over them, frozen. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy. Whenever you're ready, Victoria prompted gently, but even her kindness felt like pity. David closed his eyes. He couldn't look at the judges anymore. Couldn't see the audience that found him amusing. Couldn't bear to watch the cameras recording his humiliation for millions of future viewers. In the darkness behind his eyelids, a memory surfaced. Sharp and clear, like it had happened yesterday instead of 30 years ago. He was 12 years old, sitting at the same piano in his grandmother's living room. He'd just played a piece for her, something simple, and made several mistakes. Frustrated, he'd slammed his hands down on the keys. David, his grandmother had said, her voice calm and steady. Do you know why I asked you to learn piano? He'd shrugged, sulking. Because music doesn't care who you are or where you come from. It doesn't care if you're rich or poor, famous or unknown. When you play, you're not playing for anyone else. You're having a conversation with yourself. You're letting the world hear what's inside your heart. Young David had looked at her skeptically. But what if my heart isn't interesting enough? She'd smiled and touched his face with her weathered hand. Your heart is exactly interesting enough. Everyone's is. You just have to be brave enough to let people hear it. Sitting on that stage, with hundreds of people waiting for him to fail, David felt his grandmother's presence. Not in a supernatural way, but in the way memory can ground us when everything else feels unstable. She'd spent 5 years teaching him a particular piece, a classical work that was technically demanding and emotionally profound. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening they'd worked on it together. This piece, she told him, isn't about impressing anyone. It's about truth. Play it truthfully, and nothing else matters. He'd never performed it for anyone but her. After she died, he'd played it alone in his living room, crying through the notes, feeling her guidance in muscle memory and instinct. Now, on this stage, with people who'd already decided he wasn't worth their time, David made a choice. He could get up and walk away, spare himself further embarrassment, or he could do what his grandmother had taught him. Play truthfully. Let them hear his heart, interesting or not. His breathing steadied. His hand stopped shaking. He opened his eyes and looked at the keys with new focus. He placed his fingers in position, feeling the cool ivory beneath his calloused fingertips. The contrast struck him. These elegant keys under his rough working man's hands, but his grandmother's hands had been rough too, weathered by years of hard work, and they'd created beauty. David pressed down on the first note, soft, tentative, a single tone that hung in the air of the vast auditorium. Then the second note. The third. The melody began to unfold, quiet and unassuming like dawn breaking slowly over a sleeping city. The laughter in the audience didn't stop immediately. Someone coughed. Another person whispered. The judges shifted in their seats, probably checking their watches, calculating how long they'd have to sit through this amateur's performance. But David didn't hear any of it anymore. He was somewhere else entirely, in a place where only the music existed. The opening notes were deceptively simple, just a gentle melody that drifted across the stage like a whisper. Nothing flashy, nothing that would grab attention immediately. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded almost plain. Michael Stone glanced down at his phone under the table. He'd heard enough amateur performances to know how this would go. Pleasant enough, technically acceptable but forgettable. Another person who played piano in their spare time, thinking they were ready for the big stage. He gave it maybe 30 more seconds before he'd have to figure out how to deliver the rejection kindly. Linda Martinez was already formulating her feedback. She'd praise his courage for coming, acknowledge the emotional connection to his grandmother, then gently explain that the competition required a different level of performance, professional, polished, stage, ready. But then something happened. David's hands began to move with growing confidence across the keys. The simple melody started to shift, to deepen. What had seemed plain revealed itself as a foundation, and now he was building something on top of it. His right hand carried a flowing line that climbed higher, while his left hand added richness underneath. The music grew more complex, layers weaving together. The piece he'd chosen was Chopin's Ballad No. 1. It was a work that required not just technical skill, but emotional depth. A piece that could expose every weakness in a pianist's training, every gap in their understanding. It was bold to the point of recklessness for someone without formal training to attempt it. In the audience, a woman who'd been whispering to her friend stopped mid-sentence. Something in the music had caught her attention, not because it was loud or showy, but because there was a quality to it she hadn't expected. Honesty, maybe. Vulnerability. David's eyes remained closed. His face had transformed from nervous and uncertain to deeply peaceful. The tension had melted from his shoulders. His whole body moved with the music now, swaying slightly, his fingers dancing across the keys with increasing assurance. The melody shifted again, moving into a more turbulent section. Here was where the piece demanded real skill, rapid passages that required both hands to work in perfect coordination. Jumps across the keyboard that had to be precise. Dynamics that needed control and subtlety. David's fingers flew. Not frantically, but with purpose and precision. Each note was clear and intentional. His rough hands, so out of place on this stage minutes ago, now seemed exactly where they belonged. The calluses that had embarrassed him didn't slow him down. If anything, they seemed to give him a firmer connection to the keys. Robert Kim sat up straighter in his chair. He'd been prepared to be polite but disinterested. Now he found himself actually listening, really listening. This wasn't just competent playing. There was something else happening here. The technical execution was impressive enough, but it was the emotion behind it that caught him off guard. The music told a story. David wasn't just hitting the right notes in the right order. He was communicating something through them. Pain and joy woven together, loss and hope existing in the same phrase. It was the sound of someone who'd spent years alone with this instrument, pouring everything they couldn't say out loud into the keys. In the wings, the production assistant stood motionless, her hand pressed to her mouth. She'd seen hundreds of auditions, watched performers of all skill levels come and go. But there was something about this moment that made her skin prickle. She reached for her radio to call the control room, then stopped. They were already seeing this. Everyone was. The laughter in the audience had died completely. Row by row, person by person, they'd fallen silent. Heads that had been turned away now faced the stage. Conversation stopped mid-word. People who'd been checking their phones slipped them back into their pockets. Michael Stone set his phone down. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an expression of concentration. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, watching David's hands move across the keys. The judge, known for his cutting remarks, found himself without words. The music built toward a crescendo. This was the heart of the piece, where everything intensified. The volume rose, the tempo increased, passion flooded every note. David's whole body was involved now. His back arched as he reached for the higher keys. His foot worked the pedals, adding depth and sustain. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't notice. Victoria Hayes felt her throat tighten. She'd heard this piece performed hundreds of times. At recitals, competitions, concert halls. She'd judged pianists who'd trained at Juilliard and studied under masters. But there was something in David's performance that cut through all the technical perfection she'd heard before. It was raw, unpolished in some ways, yes, but devastatingly authentic. In the audience, a man in the 7th row realized he was holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, afraid to make a sound that might break the spell. Around him, others sat in the same frozen state. Mesmerized, the camera operators adjusted their shots instinctively, zooming in on David's face, capturing the tears that had started to stream down his cheeks. He was crying as he played, completely lost in the music. His jacket bunched awkwardly at his shoulders as he moved, his tie had gone crooked, but none of it mattered anymore. The ordinary man in the ill-fitting suit had disappeared. In his place sat a musician laying his soul bare. Linda Martinez thought about her own grandmother, gone 5 years now. She thought about all the small moments that make up a relationship. The patient teaching, the unconditional belief, the love that shapes who we become. She saw all of that in David's playing. This wasn't a performance. It was a tribute. A conversation between a man and his memories. The music shifted again, pulling back from the intensity. A quieter section now, more reflective. David's playing became tender, almost fragile. His fingers moved with delicate precision across the keys, drawing out a melody so achingly beautiful that several people in the audience felt tears in their own eyes. Backstage, other contestants had gathered to watch the monitors. The pink-haired woman who'd been so confident earlier stood silently, her arms crossed. Her expression was complicated. Respect mixed with something else. Maybe the realization that viral videos and social media followers didn't always equal genuine artistry. A young man who'd been practicing vocal runs while waiting for his turn had stopped mid-scale. He watched the screen showing David at the piano, watched this ordinary-looking middle-aged man create something extraordinary. It made him question his own performance, his own relationship with music. Was he performing to impress or to express? David moved into another powerful section. The music swelled again, demanding both strength and control. His hands crossed over each other, reaching for notes at opposite ends of the keyboard. The speed increased, but the clarity never wavered. Every single note rang out pure and true. Robert Kim found himself thinking about why he'd gotten into music in the first place. Before the fame, before the record deals and award shows, back when it was just him and a guitar in his bedroom, playing because he had to, because music was the only language that could express what he felt inside. He'd lost touch with that purity somewhere along the way. Watching David, he remembered the piece was approaching its conclusion now. David navigated a particularly difficult passage, his fingers moving so fast they blurred. Then gradually the intensity began to ease. The music started to wind down, moving toward resolution. The tempo slowed. The volume decreased. The passionate outpouring gave way to something gentler. David played the final phrases with exquisite care. Each note was placed perfectly, given exactly the right weight and duration. The melody that had been so complex, so turbulent, now simplified. It returned to something close to where it had started, but transformed by the journey. His hands moved toward the final chord. Time seemed to slow down. The entire auditorium held its collective breath. David played the last notes. His fingers pressed down and the sound filled the space. Rich and full and final, he held the chord, letting it resonate, using the pedal to sustain it as it gradually faded into silence. Then his hands lifted from the keys. He opened his eyes, blinking as if waking from a dream. His chest heaved as he drew in a shaky breath. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. The silence stretched on. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. David sat frozen at the piano, his hands still hovering above the keys where they'd lifted off. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The quiet felt impossibly loud, pressing in from all sides. Had he messed up? Had it been as bad as he feared? He'd been so lost in the music that he genuinely couldn't remember if he'd made mistakes. 4 seconds. 5. Nobody moved. Not the judges. Not the audience. Not even the camera operators. It was as if the entire auditorium had been suspended in time, caught in the aftermath of something they didn't quite know how to process. Then it started. One person in the back row stood up. Then another. Then 10 more. 20. 50. Like a wave rolling forward, the entire audience rose to their feet. And then came the sound. It started as a roar that seemed to shake the building. Applause crashed over David like a physical force. Hundreds of hands clapping together. The sound bouncing off the walls and ceiling, multiplying, becoming something almost overwhelming in its intensity. People weren't just clapping politely. They were cheering, shouting, whistling. David stood up from the piano bench on shaky legs, completely overwhelmed. His vision blurred with fresh tears. He couldn't process what was happening. These were the same people who'd been laughing at him minutes ago. The same audience that had found his appearance and his nervousness amusing. At the judges' table, all 4 were on their feet. Victoria Hayes had both hands pressed to her chest. Her professional composure cracked wide open. Tears streamed down her face openly. She wasn't trying to hide them or wipe them away. She just let them fall. Michael Stone stood with his hands braced on the table, leaning forward, shaking his head slowly back and forth. The judge, known for his sharp tongue and sharper critiques, looked genuinely stunned. His eyes were red, and if you looked closely, you could see moisture on his cheeks that he kept brushing away with the back of his hand. Linda Martinez clapped so hard her hands had to hurt, a huge smile breaking across her face. She kept saying something that the microphones couldn't quite pick up, but her lips clearly formed the words, "Oh my God," over and over. Robert Kim had his hands clasped behind his head, staring at David with an expression of pure disbelief mixed with joy. He laughed, but it wasn't mocking. It was the sound of someone whose assumptions had just been completely shattered in the best possible way. The standing ovation went on. And on. 30 seconds. 45. A full minute. David stood there awkwardly, not knowing what to do with his hands, where to look, how to respond. He gave a small wave that felt insufficient. He bowed slightly, which felt too formal. Finally, he just stood there, letting the moment wash over him. In the wings, the production assistant was openly crying, mascara running down her face. She didn't care. The stage manager next to her, a grizzled veteran who'd worked on the show for 12 seasons and thought he'd seen everything, wiped at his own eyes and muttered, "In all my years, I've never seen anything like that." Backstage in the holding area, contestants watching on monitors sat in stunned silence. The confident pink-haired woman stared at the screen, her arms wrapped around herself. She'd come here thinking she knew what it took to succeed. She'd spent thousands on image consultants and vocal coaches. She had followers and likes and shares. But watching David's performance, she realized she'd been focused on all the wrong things. The applause finally began to die down as Victoria raised her hands, gesturing for the audience to settle so they could speak. It took another 30 seconds before the noise level dropped enough for voices to be heard. People sat down reluctantly, still buzzing with energy. Victoria picked up her microphone with trembling hands. She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. Took a breath. Tried again. "I don't even know where to start," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "David, that was extraordinary." Fresh applause erupted and she had to pause again. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, Victoria continued. I've heard thousands of performances. World-class musicians, child prodigies, people who've trained their entire lives. And what you just did right here, right now, is in the top 5 performances I've ever witnessed on this stage." David's legs felt like they might give out. He couldn't speak, couldn't form words. Michael Stone took his microphone and the audience hushed, curious what the notoriously tough judge would say. He stared at David for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "When you walked out here, I judged you. I looked at you and made assumptions about what you were capable of, based on your appearance, your job, your background. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry." His voice got stronger. "You just taught all of us, including me, an incredibly important lesson. Talent doesn't look like any one thing. Artistry doesn't require a pedigree or a fancy school or the right clothes. What you have, what you just showed us, that's something that can't be taught in any conservatory. That's heart." That's soul. That's what music is supposed to be about. The audience applauded again, agreeing with him. Linda picked up her microphone next. Your grandmother must have been an incredible teacher, she said warmly. Not just of technique, but of feeling. Of truth. Every note you played was honest. There was no pretense, no showing off. Just pure, genuine expression. That's so rare, David, so precious. What you have is a gift, and I'm so grateful you had the courage to share it with us today. Robert Kim was the last to speak. Man, he said, shaking his head with a smile. You scared me there at the beginning. I thought, oh no, this is going to be painful to watch. Then you started playing, and about 20 seconds in, I realized I was witnessing something special. By the middle of that piece, I had chills running down my spine, and by the end, I was thinking about why I fell in love with music in the first place. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Thank you for that. David finally found his voice, though it came out scratchy and uncertain. Thank you. All of you. I almost didn't come today. I almost backed out a dozen times. I didn't think I belonged here. You belong here more than most people who audition for this show, Victoria said firmly. What you did wasn't just technically impressive, though it absolutely was. You moved people. You connected with us. That's the whole point of art, isn't it? To make people feel something real. Michael leaned back in his chair. Obviously, we need to vote. But before we do, I just want to say that this audition is going to live in this show's history. People are going to be talking about this for years. The four judges looked at each other. Some unspoken communication passed between them. Then, almost simultaneously, they all reached for the buttons in front of them. 4 green lights illuminated. 4 yes votes. The audience erupted again, but the judges weren't finished. Victoria stood up from behind the table. She looked at her fellow judges, and they all nodded. She walked around to the front of the judges' table and placed her hand on a large golden button that sat in the center. David's eyes widened. He knew what that button meant. Everyone who watched the show knew. The golden buzzer was reserved for the most exceptional acts, the ones that transcended the competition. It sent an act straight through to the live shows, bypassing all other rounds. Each judge could only press it once per season. David, Victoria said, her hand resting on the button. Some performances are just yes-worthy. They're good enough to move forward, to compete, to see what happens. But some performances are so special, so rare, that they deserve something more. David's hand went to his mouth. He couldn't believe what was happening. This is one of those performances, Victoria said. She looked him directly in the eye. For your grandmother. For every person who's ever been told they're not good enough. For everyone who's ever been afraid to share their gift with the world. She pressed the button. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling, catching the stage lights as it fluttered down. The audience lost their minds completely, the noise level doubling. The other 3 judges came around from behind their table to congratulate David, who stood in the middle of the stage covered in golden confetti, crying openly. Victoria reached him first and pulled him into a tight hug. You did it, she said in his ear, her own voice breaking. You really did it. Through his tears and the noise and the chaos, David thought of his grandmother. He hoped somehow, wherever she was, she could see this moment. She'd been right all along. His heart had been interesting enough. He just needed to be brave enough to let people hear it, and he had been. The confetti was still falling when David finally made it off stage. His legs felt like rubber, and he had to lean against the wall for a moment just to steady himself. The production assistant who'd been kind to him earlier appeared with a bottle of water, which he accepted with shaking hands. That was incredible, she said, beaming at him. I mean, truly incredible. David couldn't quite process her words. Everything felt surreal, like he was watching someone else's life unfold. Had that really just happened? The golden buzzer? Him? Through the door, he could hear the next contestant being called to the stage. Life went on. The show continued. But for David, time felt suspended, stretched thin like taffy. He checked his phone with fumbling fingers and saw 17 missed calls from Rachel. 23 text messages. The most recent one was just capital letters. Dad, oh my God, Dad, he called her back and she answered before the first ring finished. You did it. She screamed so loudly he had to hold the phone away from his ear. Dad, you did it. I'm watching with everyone at school in the cafeteria and we're all crying. Mr. Henderson, my math teacher, he's crying. The lunch lady is crying. Everyone is losing their minds, David laughed, the sound coming out watery and strange. I can't believe it happened. I can, Rachel said, her voice suddenly fierce with pride. I knew you could do it. I always knew. Grandma knew too. She told you that you had something special, remember? She was right. After he hung up, David sat in the hallway outside the holding area, not quite ready to face the other contestants yet. He closed his eyes and let himself feel everything he'd been too overwhelmed to process on stage. The fear that had gripped him when people laughed. The way that fear had dissolved when his fingers touched the keys. The sense of his grandmother's presence guiding him through each phrase. The shocking, overwhelming response when he finished. His phone buzzed again. His brother Tom. I'm sorry, the text read. I was wrong. You were amazing. I'm proud of you. More messages came flooding in. Cousins he hadn't spoken to in years. Former co-workers. His boss at the warehouse. Even people he barely knew from his neighborhood. The video was already spreading online, apparently. Clips of his performance. Screenshots of the judges' reactions. The moment Victoria pressed the golden buzzer. When David finally returned to the holding area, the atmosphere had completely changed. The contestants who'd been confident before now looked at him with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. The pink-haired woman approached him hesitantly. Hey, she said, that was really beautiful. What you did out there. Thank you, David replied, meaning it. I've been training for this for 5 years, she continued, and there was something vulnerable in her voice now. Voice coaches, image consultants, social media strategy. I thought I had it all figured out. Then I watched you play, and I realized I'd been so focused on looking the part that I forgot about the actual music. About meaning it. David didn't know what to say to that. I'm sure you're very talented. She smiled sadly. Maybe, but you taught me something important today, so thank you for that. The drive home that evening felt like floating. David kept glancing at himself in the rearview mirror, expecting to look different somehow. Transformed, but he looked exactly the same. A 42-year-old warehouse manager with tired eyes and too much gray in his hair, except now he was also the guy who'd gotten the golden buzzer. Both things were true at the same time. When he pulled into his driveway, he saw them. Neighbors lined up on his lawn. Rachel stood on the front porch, practically bouncing with excitement. Someone had made a sign that read, "Congratulations, David," in glittery letters. He got out of the car and they erupted in applause. His neighbor from 3 houses down, whom he'd only ever exchanged waves with, pulled him into a hug. We always heard you playing through the windows, she said. We had no idea you were that good. The celebration spilled into his living room. Someone had brought a cake. Someone else brought champagne. Rachel showed him her phone, scrolling through thousands of comments on videos of his performance. Look at this one, she kept saying. And this one. Dad, you're going viral. But the moment David would remember most came later after everyone had left. He sat alone at his grandmother's old piano, the same one he'd played thousands of times before. The keys felt familiar under his fingers. Home. He played a few notes from the piece he'd performed, and emotion welled up in his chest. This piano had been his refuge for so long. His private space where he could be himself without fear of judgment. And now that privacy had been blown wide open, millions of people had heard him play. More would see it when the episode aired on television. His safe, small world had suddenly become very large. It was terrifying. But it was also thrilling. The next few weeks passed in a blur of interviews and preparation for the live shows. The show's producers wanted to feature his story. Cameras came to his house, filmed him at work in the warehouse, captured footage of him playing his grandmother's piano. They wanted to know everything about his relationship with her, about his journey to music. David tried to explain it, though words felt inadequate. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, he told the interviewer. She believed in me when I had no reason to believe in myself. The piano was how she showed me love. Every lesson, every correction, every encouragement. It was all love. At work, his coworkers treated him differently now. Not badly, but there was an awkwardness that hadn't been there before. They didn't quite know how to relate to him. He was still David, still the guy who managed inventory and helped load trucks, but he was also becoming someone else. Someone they'd seen on television. Someone who might not be working at the warehouse much longer. The manager called him into the office one afternoon. Listen, he said, we're all really proud of you. What you did was amazing. But I need to know, are you planning to stay? Because if you're going to leave, I need to start looking for your replacement. It was a fair question. David thought about it. I don't know, he admitted. I never expected any of this. I'm just trying to take it one day at a time. Well, whenever you figure it out, let me know. And David? Win that thing, okay? Give us something to brag about. The night before he left for the live shows, David sat at his piano one last time. Rachel came and sat beside him, just like she used to when she was little, just like David had sat beside his grandmother. Are you scared? She asked. Terrified, he admitted. I keep thinking about how many people will be watching, how easy it would be to mess up, how different everything might be after this. Rachel leaned her head on his shoulder. Do you regret it? Auditioning. David thought about the question seriously. His life had been simpler before, quieter, more predictable, but also smaller. He'd spent so many years playing it safe, staying in his comfortable corner of the world. One moment of courage had cracked that corner wide open. No, he said finally. I don't regret it at all. Good, because Grandma wouldn't want you to play it safe. She'd want you to play it true. David smiled at that. His daughter was wiser than her 16 years. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Not the Chopin piece this time, but something else. A simple melody his grandmother had taught him first years and years ago. The very first piece he'd ever learned. Rachel hummed along softly, and in that moment everything felt right. Whatever happened next, whether he won or lost, whether his life changed completely or returned to normal, this moment was perfect. Him and his daughter and his grandmother's piano. Music connecting the past to the present to the future. The next morning, David packed his bags and headed to the airport. He was still a warehouse manager from Cleveland. Still an ordinary man with calloused hands and an ill-fitting suit. But he was also something more now. He was living proof that ordinary people could do extraordinary things. That it was never too late to be brave. That the things we love in private might be exactly what the world needs to hear. As the plane took off, David looked out the window at his city getting smaller below. He thought about his grandmother, about the countless hours she'd spent teaching him. She'd given him more than piano skills. She'd given him the courage to believe that his voice mattered. That his heart, exactly as it was interesting enough. And she'd been right all along. The competition ahead would be fierce. The stakes would be high. But David had already won the thing that mattered most. He'd found the courage to step into the light. To let the world hear what he'd been protecting in the quiet corners of his life. To play not for applause or validation, but because the music itself demanded to be shared. Whatever happened next, he was ready.